Can we just, I mentioned there Liz Truss saying maybe we can unpick the commitment to 2050 net zero, but I mean, surely the whole point is since Theresa May enshrined it in law, we are legally bound. I mean, personally, I think that tying the hands of successive governments is always a bad idea, but since Theresa May, we are legally bound to hit that target.
Yeah, that's correct. And one of the reasons why we are legally bound is to make sure there is this longer term direction of travel. And that's really important for the businesses and other enterprises that invest in our energy system, to make sure they've got an idea of the longer term course that we need to go in. Because right now we're suffering under a situation where we didn't think enough longer term about how our dependence on things like gas or a lack of insulation in our homes could make us more vulnerable to the kind of situation that we're in now. So it's good to have these longer term things. I mean, I generally agree with you that sometimes they can be difficult for tying the hands of governments into the future, but they're so important for setting a longer term direction for businesses and others who invest in the things that we need, like energy.
A lot of those businesses are already getting it right, you could argue, couldn't you? I mean, 2001, that was the year when we used most energy in this country. It was 30% more than we now use. So, given that, do we need some of the measures, whether it's on boilers or banning diesel engines by 2030? Do we need some of those, what some people see as pretty draconian measures anyway?
Look, the key thing you've got to have in our minds at the moment is that the reason why we're suffering under this huge cost of living crisis with the price of energy spiking is because of the situation with gas. Now, there are basically two reasons why gas is so expensive at the moment. One is the bounce back of economies after COVID and the need for a lot of gas around the world as certain parts of the world have opened up and so on. And the second is Putin's war in Ukraine. And what that means is the price of gas has shot up. And the most expensive thing that's providing our energy then determines the kind of prices that we get as consumers. And so we're in a situation where we're suffering from higher prices that, as we know, are going to get much higher as we head through the winter because of our dependence on energy that is determined by the price of fossil fuels. So the more stuff we do to use less energy, so we save money, and also to get our energy from non-fossil fuel sources will mean that we decouple our dependence on those very expensive markets. Laurie, and that's the key thing to do. So all of the things we consider have to have that in mind.
I mean, there'll be people saying, well, that's we get all that, but we also get the necessity of making sure you've got a subtle energy mix so that when the gas is incredibly expensive, you can fall back to some degree on nuclear, and you shouldn't be blowing up old coal, blowing up, for heaven's sake, old coal-fired power stations. I mean, of course, we don't want them necessarily. Most people don't want them, but in a time of crisis, they serve a purpose.
Yeah, and all governments around the world right now are looking at a mix of energy sources in this moment of immediate crisis. And over the course of the winter, you'll see all sorts of different sources being used, some heavy, polluting fossil fuel sources like coal and being used. The question is that over the coming years, this situation is probably not going to disappear where we're getting these kind of high prices. And so we've got to go for broke to invest in the kind of energy system that makes sure we are strategically secure, that we are no longer in a situation where we're in hock to what Putin is doing. Because if these kind of events continue to happen and we continue to be dependent on the high price of fossil fuels like we are right now, that's the primary cause of what we're experiencing at the moment, then we're in serious trouble. Yeah. It will need more investment to decouple us from that situation. And also insulating buildings, win-win. We'll use less energy anyway. We'll be warmer in the winter.
Laurie, just on insulating buildings, I mean, I want to grapple with a particularly thorny nettle. And it seems to be very bad manners at the moment to, and I'll invite a response from you because you clearly, care passionately about this. If we're talking about energy prices rocketing, and people really have to start thinking very hard about rationing. I mean, this is not to in any way advocate changes that will see people suffer or, old people die in the cold. I mean, clearly support's needed there. But we all know people, you know people, I know people whose lives are spent living in homes where the thermostat is on way higher than it need be. So on an individual basis, can we see some rationing choices made that you would approve of? And why aren't more environmentalists coming forward and saying, actually, stop lamenting £5,000 a year? on energy bills, because actually that is the impetus that's required to really change behaviour.
I think so I get what you're saying. I get the logic. And yes, I do think there's a lot that could be done to change people's individual use to make it more efficient so we're not wasting as much energy. I mean, sure, there's loads of that stuff. And I agree. I think that the government should provide us with some leadership that's missing at the moment and stand up and say, we have a plan for this winter. It's going to involve giving you some money to help with your bills, the people who particularly need it, and at the scale that's needed, which is probably something along the lines of what we saw in COVID in the scale of financial support to help people. We've also got this more medium-term plan to help insulate homes and to deal with this structurally, to make the strategic investments. But in return, here are a list of things that we would ask people to do to help cut some of their energy use. And that list has already been disseminated by governments, say in Europe, like France and so on. But we have to be careful because a lot of people, as you're inferring there, are going to be pushed into a very dangerous situation.